Hey everyone, I'm R.R. Virdi, and I'm here to talk with Forbidden Planet on Forbidden Planet TV about my new book, The First Binding, all of which copies at Forbidden Planet are going to be hopefully signed with all of these book plates right here, which is a lot.
Welcome to Forbidden Planet. I'm Andrew Sumner. Here, once again, we have the head buyer of books at Forbidden Planet, the one and only Laura Jane Dodd. How are you doing, mate?
Very well, thank you. Very well. How are you, Andrew?
I am very well indeed, and all the better because we have a very special guest, the one and only best-selling author, R.R. Virdi. Ronnie Virdi, how are you doing, mate?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys for having me this morning.
Oh, thank you for joining us in what is our afternoon. And no word of a lie, as I was saying off camera, Dodd is a massive fan of yours. And a book that we're very excited about is the first installment in your first binding series, which we're here to talk all about. But rather than me ask these questions, I think Dodd, the super fan, is gonna jump straight in.
Thanks. So, Ronnie, you've had a load of experience in kind of self-publishing and more kind of urban fantasy. So how does writing your debut epic fantasy differ?
Wow. Given especially the prose choice that I made, it was completely the opposite of prose that I've been writing for like the last 10 years. A lot of urban fantasy obviously derives from like the earlier works of Laurel K. Hamilton and Jim Butcher. So there's this very like clipped noir, terse, and mystery style prose that you see a lot. And I put 10 years into that. But I actually grew up as a theater kid, writing songs and lyricism and poetry through high school, just not something I advertised in high school because that wasn't cool, right? So going back to that was really hard, but also extremely fun and liberating. But that was part of the purpose of the story, specifically because the protagonist is a storyteller. And I had to go back through a lot of history of oral tradition of how people would narrate a story aloud. And part of that is to also sound beautiful, which sounds kind of superfluous today. Like I'm breaking a lot of the rules of fiction of passive voice belaboring a point, but it sounds pretty. And that's actually part of a storyteller's job back then when you didn't have as much entertainment. The only thing you could do is go to a pub and either a drunk guy in a corner is telling a story very poorly, or you have a professional telling it and it's actually pleasing to listen to.
And you mentioned Jim Butcher there. So he's kind of like your hype man, right?
Yeah. Jim, I've been very fortunate to have Jim in my life in a lot of different regards. From meeting him at a signing in 2011 when he released Ghost Story, where he saved my life that night, and then years again later at a seminar that Kevin J. Anderson teaches called the Superstars Seminar, where they teach the business of writing. And I met him there just before the Dragon Awards happened, which I was fortunate to be nominated with him alongside in the same category, which I was never going to win. And then years later, he came into my life officially as a mentor. And he's been guiding me through the business and really helping me, and then was kind enough to read and give a blurb for this book.
Very, very, very cool. I mean, as hype men go,
Yeah.
that's
Surely the only one to have.
yeah. I know, right? So did you find that kind of, especially obviously with your new book, the kind of use of past and present timelines, was it difficult to kind of keep track of? Because I think I've read about you before that you're like more of a pantser than a planner. So
Yeah.
was that like
It
impossible?
was, and since I still study structure because I'm really persistent about the craft. And I think what happens is I just internalize it and I pick beats and things that I want out of my brain that I've narrowed down. But I had to sort of create at least a structure in terms of I broke up the book into sections of his life, both past and present, of what I wanted to accomplish. And I was allowed to pants those sections as long as I finished to a certain point, and then it would go back to the past. And I had this certain point I needed to complete, and I was just going back and forth. But it was definitely a learning experience, which is another reason I wanted to write this. I definitely believe in like learning by doing, and I was hoping by doing this book, I would only get better and better at telling more complex and different stories than I've already sort of become accustomed to doing.
So, Ronnie, you've had this kind of amazing sort of Catherine wheel voyage through fantasy almost. So you've got, urban fantasy detective, you've got virtual fantasy world, you've got space opera. Can you tell us a bit about where the first binding is actually going and what the premise of the first novel is?
Yeah. So the first binding is kind of a story not just about self-discovery, but about sort of saving the world while you save yourself. Because the story starts out, Ari kind of has already alluded to having this complicated past, and he's damaged. He's suffered a lot, but he's still going in spite of that. He has this underlying current of hope. I didn't want him to be like a resigned character who's given up completely. And there's this point where he tells Eloine, the female love interest, that he's responsible for killing the world, at least as far as he sees it. And the present day story is him trying to rectify that one principal mistake he's made in the past, which I haven't shared yet. So there's both the past and present story, which I wanted to keep active. Since it's getting a lot of comparisons to King Killer, one thing I wanted to do was Quoth is a very passive character in the beginning of the series and in the present timeline. And that's not a criticism. That's the story that he's telling. I wanted Ari to be a different counterpoint in that he's trying to fix actively what he broke. He can't help himself in that. And it's something you're going to see pop up in his past life, that he can't help himself in certain situations. He tries to do the right thing, but that doesn't always lead to the right outcome. Not necessarily by intent, but life is life. And sometimes bad things are going to happen. You're not going to have all the information that you need to do the right thing sometimes. You only get it in hindsight. And he's just someone trying to do the best he can. So the present day story is him trying to fix a world that he feels responsible for breaking, and the audience just hasn't seen how it's broken yet. But some of the clues are there in the first book. You see issues of kingdoms sort of falling apart, political strife happening, and he feels responsible for all of it.
Very interesting.
I mean, yeah, it's incredible. I mean, Ari as a character is so kind of, there's such ambition and kind of so driven to kind of, I suppose, do the right thing. Do you kind of see yourself in that character?
Yeah. So there's also a lot of nods, things. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but part of the reason you see silence and stillness in part of Ari's life is I've struggled with depression a lot. And this is something through Ari's trauma that he has, because it's something I know I can speak to. And as someone who's an entertainer and creative person, one of the opposites to that is stillness and silence. It's why in the opening, this part I can give part of the spoiler to. There's more reasons why I wrote that, but Ari feels obsessed to break it. It's sort of like the antithesis to who he is at his being. And a lot of people, when they talk about depression, and they mention things about how the world feels gray. You lose like sense of color. Things feel still. So does your mind. There is like a silence of like things that either bring you joy, muted emotional reactions. So that's part of me bringing in a touch of things I've experienced to Ari and someone who's gone a similar path. As for the ambition and the underlying current of hope, that's absolutely coming from me as well. I wasn't trying to project that, but it's something I wanted to see done more in fiction for characters who might have trauma and mental illness, things that keep you going. I am a very hopeful person, which runs counter to my depression. I think I've had to make myself into that person. I'm weirdly optimistic for someone with depression, and I've had to like train myself to be, but it's kept me going. And every time something good happens, it reinforces that side of me, which has been like a helpful thing to keep combating depression, if that makes sense. Like I just published my traditional epic fantasy with a blurb from my favorite hero. Like that's insane. And you don't think those things happen, but when they do, they give you those more like building blocks to keep going. And Ari is sort of clinging to that. The small triumphs and victories that he can have keep him going. I didn't want him to feel resigned and broken completely, that he's just given up.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important thing in fantasy writing and sci-fi writing in general, is that idea of hope. And I think obviously so many of us as like geeky, misunderstood kids and stuff came to read fantasy and play games and stuff because of that.
Absolutely. So,
yeah, it's very, very important. So speaking of kind of I suppose pivotal characters, there's also the idea of almost like the tavern being a character in itself. So if you could visit any bar in fiction, TV, film, games, where would you have to visit?
Oh man, I have such a bad, weird answer to this because it's more inspired from the games, but I want to visit one of the taverns in The Witcher only because I have a annoying fascination with the game Gwent, which is not a good reason to pick a tavern because I don't think the game developers ever decided for Gwent to be that popular and fun, but I got addicted to the mini game and I'm like, I would love to just sit in a tavern and pass time with this fascinating card game I enjoy. But that world is horrible. Like the amount of bar fights that happen in the Witcher games is like people are getting murdered left and right, and I'd probably be one of them. And I'm like, it's not a good tavern to pick, but I want to sit there and play the card game.
I mean, that's fair enough. As a I mean, I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, and so Triple Triad like took up far too much of my time.
Dodd, do you have an answer to that question, by the way?
Well, two potentials. So either Seventh Heaven from Final Fantasy VII, because it'd be cool to like hang out with Barrett and the guys, or the Bronze from Buffy. So
those are two really, really good ones. Wow, I actually wish I thought of that one, the Buffy one. Jeez,
that's a very good one. I'm going to jump in with my own, which is a place. Not only have I wanted to spend time there, I actually have spent time in this place because it's a real world joint. So it's John's Grill in San Francisco, which is where Sam Spade drinks and eats in the Maltese Falcon, and it's a real place, cool. and it's one of the places that Hammett drunk himself to death in, and you can still order Sam Spade's dinner when you go in there, which is pork chops, by the way. Yeah.
I didn't know that was a real place. That's cool, because I've actually got a copy of the Maltese Falcon back there behind the Direwolf banner, because I grew up with mystery novels before fiction.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so it's the lamb chops, actually. You can go and have the lamb chops, and the Maltese Falcon is actually behind the bar.
That's cool.
Yeah. Excellent question, Dodd. What else have you got?
So touching on some of the research for the book, so obviously it's huge in scale. I just grabbed my proof copy just to show Andrew, because I don't think you've seen quite how
I have not seen how meaty it actually is. I'd seen the cover, but I didn't realize what a weighty tome it was.
So where did you start with the research? I mean, having things like, the Golden Road is like a version of the Silk Road and stuff. There's just so much meat in there. So where did you start?
The first place I really started was advised to me by a friend of mine, and it's a book called Silk Roads, plural, A New History of the World by Peter Frankopan. And it covers everything from the trade along the Silk Road, economy, mostly focuses on religion and religions being birthed, and political interactions between countries and leaders at the time, which I really needed to understand to the depth I did. Even though you don't see that at the forefront of the novels right now, there are a lot of things I secretly clued in happening in the backdrop that I'm alluding to that lead to a bigger story of itself that I learned how to do from there. The Ibn Fadlan, which is the collections of stories by Ibn Battu, he's kind of considered the Islamic version of Marco Polo before Marco Polo, and he journeyed across all the way from the Middle East to met the Vikings, went all the way to Serbia, I believe parts of Russia, and it was really cool seeing how frequently traders actually did this. They would take these massive 3,000 to 8,000 mile long journeys once or every 2 years. And it showed how information traveled along the world. People traded stories, they traded folklore, which is why you see similarities between myths popping up. Another place I went to a lot was a YouTuber named Krekenford, who is a specialist in Indo-Proto-European mythology. And he's shown so much research of how there's similarities between gods, certain exact story myths, including story beats that have been repeated from Mahabharata, Rig Veda, Raman, down to the Iliad and Odyssey. There are some huge similarities between those two stories, and all these dial up to when you get someone like Joseph Campbell showing the hero's myth of how a lot of the most famous stories throughout history have used similar key beats. And that's part of something I'm doing in the first binding. I have my own nesting stories, which are sort of analogs of real ones that have happened to help build my world, but also show that a lot of the most famous stories in the past, but also today, have been reusing the same beats. It's not the only way to tell fiction, but it is extremely prevalent, and there's a reason I'm doing that I don't want to share. Some readers will figure that part out later.
Mate, your sense of cultural history is very rich. It's very evident in your writing, and you clearly have a lot of cultural reference points and things that inspire you. We were talking off camera about your love of classic cars, for example.
Yes,
something you wouldn't traditionally so into your literature. But if you had, what would be your top 2 or 3 dream cars?
And they're all classics. So 67 Corvette Stingray, which you and I talked about. And I don't know if I do the convertible or the hardtop, because I like both, especially with the split window.
Oh, me too. Yeah, right on.
66 AC Cobra. And at this point, I think you can't get the classic anymore. You have to get the replicas, but the replicas are so well made. I'm like, okay, one of those. And I love that it's a fusion between the British styling, and then Cheryl Kelby went, how do we make it a little bit more aggressive? And let's just put the biggest Ford motor we absolutely can into it. Yeah, I just love that idea. And then the other one would probably be a classic Ferrari 250 GTO, just because it's such a gorgeous car. I know. I grew up in a very interesting community where it was built in the 50s and 60s, and it's mostly all the same pop-up housing for Korean War veterans. So I actually grew up surrounded by a lot of people with muscle cars and classic cars. They were always restoring and working on them, which is, I think, one of the things that like made me love both cars, but also that time period and era of cars, both especially British, Italian, and then American.
And it's a beautiful confluence of technology and aesthetics, isn't it? I think
Yes.
that's the great thing about that period of time. You must have loved, because I'm assuming that you're a big movie fan. You must have loved Ford versus Ferrari, which I think
I
captures that
did.
era really well.
Yes. And it also just captures the struggle and the lead of innovation and like how companies like take things out
Yes.
through, well, I guess in this case racing, but they do it in so much more because that's the history of Lamborghini, where there's that famous story of how he wanted to buy a Ferrari and he was like turned away from it. And he's like, fine, I'll go make my own supercar. And then he comes out with the Miura, which is like one of the most gorgeous cars ever to have existed.
Yeah, no, right on. So, in terms of movies, movie reference points for you, movie inspirations outside of that movie we've just name checked. What's operated a big influence upon you, mate?
In terms of at least this work, Forrest Gump was definitely one of them because it uses a similar structure. But I love the idea of the most interesting man in the world. And one of the things I really enjoyed about it, especially now having written this book, is when you go back and watch it, the level of disbelief some people have in his story for the true parts, which is something I've always liked, that like people want to believe what they want to believe, even if they don't like, you could give them the truth, but if it's not the truth they want to hear, they won't believe it. And there's a scene where Forrest is telling people that he's one of the leads behind the Bubba Gump Fishing Company, which is this massive conglomeration in the world. And the man sitting next to him just absolutely laughs like he said the most ridiculous thing in the world. But his story is literally he served in Vietnam with this man who inspired him to do that. And he comes back and has this ridiculous fishing trip, which goes amok and then ends up like all the other boats in competition sinking. And he and his crippled lieutenant are the last two survivors who have like this claim to this massive gulfing area of shrimp. And they just turn it into this bazillion-dollar corporation. I'm like, that's such a cool story. And then people don't want to believe it. That influenced me to want to tell something similar here, where what truths could be so great and amazing that people instantly think they're lies, but it's really cool for the readers to go, oh no, that's true.
Yeah, I think it's also a metaphor, of course, for one of the key problems that we have in society today, which is people wanting to believe their personal truth and objectively the truth, right?
Yes. And how things get twisted. And we see it happening on Twitter, especially because of how fast and short it is,
100%.
where someone's story can be retweeted and a few comments added. And by the time you're on the 10th person, it can be a completely removed story and the context lost, which is something I've done here, where in some cases, Ari is responsible for it, but retelling his story so much has led to all these lies about what really happened, as well as sometimes his identity is removed from it. It's become another person, another name, sometimes very similar to his, sometimes completely removed, including to where his name shows up very altered and culturally reappropriated in other cultures. So Ari's myths now belong to other people, and it's almost like he never existed, but that heroic thing he did has always been part of someone else's mythology when it hasn't. But if enough time passes and enough tongues tell the story, it becomes co-opted.
That is absolutely fascinating, mate. We're racing towards the end of our conversation. So, Dodd, do you have a question to close us out on?
Yeah, I do. So, well, I have two actually. So one is to do with the series and obviously what you're planning next. And then the other one is Soulsborne related.
Okay. I'm down with both, yeah.
So we'll do the plans for the series. So I know it's a 3-book deal with Tor and Gavance. Yep. So is it kind of one a year and then
about one a year, because they're so large, they might give me a little bit more time on my contract than a year, but I've been pretty close to that. Book 2 was originally due January this year, but they were really understanding that after the first book went out, there's, we had to do a lot of editing. They're big books. They had their timeline and other authors to get out this August. The pandemic's been wonking things up, plus every resurgence of a new variant has like slowed things down. So I turned in book 2 this July before book 1 came out. And I'm hoping to turn in book 3 somewhere around there next year or a little bit before book 2 actually comes out. And then we'll see from where to go from there with the series.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. And then the big question, how do you get good at Soulsborne games?
Oh God, I want to give the trite answer, which is like just keep playing. But a lot of it that I realized for me is pattern recognition, because it is built into like all those characters. They have ridiculous patterns that you can learn and timing, and it is a thing of getting used to those and maybe kite. Like what I used to do is I used to kite enemies, so I would like go up and aggro them and keep backing off and watching what loops they would go through to get the timing, and then finishing them off. Especially if it's an area with not a mob of enemies,
Mhm.
like when I was first fighting the Black Knights in the earlier Dark Souls games specifically. Um, and it is really just timing and pattern recognition, being willing to grind and take your time, which sounds so simple, but it's true. Because if you back off when you're kiting an enemy, sometimes they'll fall into their own pattern loop and just keep attacking thin air, which is the thing that taught me, like, oh yeah, these guys are on like a pattern system. You don't know what pattern they're going to do next, but they are all pattern based enemies. And it helps. The only game that ever threw me for a loop that they made was Sekiro, because it was such a combat shift of, this is not parry and dodge souls. It is absolutely block, and you keep fighting. You do not back off your opponent, which completely threw me when I was rolling and dodging and getting cut in half.
I love the intellectual rigor that you've applied to that answer. Pattern recognition. That's what I'm
Yeah.
taking away from this conversation. That's amazing. This has been the mighty Ronnie Virdi, R.R. Virdi, talking about his spectacular new series, The First Binding, which everybody watching this can order from the links attached to this conversation. And in conversation with the mighty Laura Dodd, the one and only Laura Dodd. Thanks so much for joining us, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you.
Likewise, thank you guys for everything.
Yeah, and I would say continued success with your series. I'm not sure I told you this at the top of the meeting, but my son is a big fan of the Grave Report series. Huge fan of that.
Oh, no way.
He loves it. Yeah, mate. He loves it. Big influence on him, actually. So
awesome.
thank you for creating that.
You're welcome. And let them know book 4 is coming soon-ish. I've already started it, so hopefully within next year.
I absolutely will. And again, The First Binding, everybody can order that right here. And it's a pleasure, mate. You have a lovely rest of your day.
You too. Thank you, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye. If you're enjoying watching Forbidden Planet TV and you're enjoying watching us talk to the world's most interesting and accomplished filmmakers, authors, artists, musicians, creators, subscribe right here. See you soon.